So I have two children, and as anyone who's ever listened to a child telling a story before can attest to, children rarely make good storytellers. And to kind of understand why, I'm going to show you an example. This is a real example of a story that I wrote when I was a child, about 6 years old, maybe. I just discovered a typewriter, how to use it, just about. It was called The Figgles. There were some little people named the Figgles, who lived in a posh house. One day, the Figgles went to the land of magic, but it took a long time. Besides, they did get into some mischief, like this. When they were half there, Daddy went home to get some food. The next minute, Alison got pulled into a tree, so the two Figgles went on. That minute, Mummy fell down a trap, so Robert went on. He pulled a big rock back, and there he found himself swimming. He stopped swimming. There he was in Magic Land. There in front of him, there was the rest of his gang. They were so happy to be home. So, spelling issues aside, and complete lack of punctuation aside, do you kind of see the problem here? Let's rehash that again. So, the Figgles went to the land of magic, and then Daddy went home to get food. And then Alison got pulled into a tree. And then Mummy fell down a trap. And then Robert went swimming. And then Robert pulled back a rock. And then everyone was there. It's just and then, and then, and then, and then, and then. So it's not so much a story as it is just a sequence of things that happened. It's a shopping list of activities that follows sequentially one after the other in a chronological order, sure, and yes, it has the same characters, the Figgles, but a story, it's not. In E.M. Forster's 1927 text, Aspects of the Novel, Forster talks about this difference that we're describing here quite starkly. He gives two examples and see if you can spot the key difference between them. The king died, and then the queen died. The king died, and then the queen died of grief. Now notice here that the addition of just two words completely changes our shopping list of activities into an actual story because it introduces the ideas of consequence. Characters make decisions which then have consequences which in turn impact those characters, and that in essence is a story. And because no one lives in a vacuum, in all likelihood you have multiple characters, all with different motivations, all pulling in different directions. Each character wants something different, and each character is differently capable of achieving that want. And it is where those points of desire intersect that we find conflict, character conflict. And it is from that conflict that we get story. Not just an and then shopping list of activities, an actual story. All of which I'm sure you're thinking is lovely, Rob, but why am I lecturing you about this? Well, it's simply because it took me a very long time to learn this lesson. And it's only really now that I'm kind of looking back and documenting everything that I can actually see that painful, misguided journey that I went on to discovering this very simple truism of writing. So in one of my last videos, I told you about Macabre, which was my first full-length novel, which I wrote at the age of 17. And I mentioned at the time that I somehow lucked into it having a really good structure. Yes, it was very pretentious. Yes, it was horribly written. Yes, I've seen children's paddling pools with more depth than some of these characters. But at least there was an actual story there. At its heart, Kai's conflict in that novel was an internal one. And to put it succinctly, a lot of Christians in the world, they see themselves as fundamentally good people who are battling against an inner monster. In this novel, Kai was a literal monster, a vampire, who was battling against his inner Christian. It's a reversed situation, and with that reversal, you have an interesting dynamic, a tension, which leads to an interesting story, or at the very least, the potential for an interesting story. Now, the problem was, in the wake of this kind of fluke success, having decided that I really liked the idea of being a writer and that this was indeed an avenue that I wanted to explore further, I found myself weirdly unable to repeat that trick. And despite multiple attempts to write additional novels, and I mean multiple attempts, that beginner's luck that I'd exhibited with Macabre, it seemed to have dried up, and the writing never again came that easily to me. But I didn't mean that I stopped trying, and over the course of the next 2 years ahead of university, I started writing not just 1 or 2 or 3 or 10 novels I started writing. So this was really that period of time where I was starting to kind of flex my muscles as a writer. I was learning the craft, finding my voice, and like any skill, it wasn't always a straightforward journey, and there were a lot of false starts along the way. But we are all about backing up and documenting things here, so let's lay it all bare, and we'll start at the beginning with My Enemy's Enemy, a fantasy novel which follows Queen Elios, the leader of a nomadic tribe of nature-loving people. While attempting to complete the rites of passage that would raise her to queen status, the tribe gets attacked by goblins and sold into slavery. Elios then teams up with an escapee from the goblin mines and persuades him to help her free her people from bondage. Abandoned after 6 chapters, and those were some painful 6 chapters to write, let me tell you. I could not find my groove with this one. Craven Cowardice. My attempt at doing a Terry Pratchett Discworld, but without any of the humour. We follow Dave and Susan, 2 ordinary people from our world, as they get caught up in magical shenanigans. Abandoned after 3 chapters. We Happy Few. It's the turn of superheroes this time, as we follow a group of 5 not particularly impressive heroes who nevertheless are trying their best to save the world, and a borderline demigod-like entity who can barely be controlled and doesn't particularly care about anything, who follows them around as they struggle to hold back the hordes of hell from breaking into the real world. Abandoned after 4 chapters. Celebrity. A satirical dystopia which follows 2 characters, one who is famous but on the decline, desperate to save her career, and one who was a nobody that had just been plucked off the street and had no idea how she was being used by others. Abandoned after 3 chapters. 7 Shades of Blue. Man, I really sucked at the naming of these things. This was my attempt at doing a Douglas Adams this time, but without much of the humour. We follow the exploits of Alex, a well-meaning idiot who is currently on the run from authorities due to him accidentally falling in love with an extremely powerful serial killer, and helping him is his best friend Charlie Wessex, a genetically engineered super genius whom no one takes seriously because of the fact that she also happens to have 3 breasts. Abandoned after 8 chapters. Actually, I kinda like this one. I might return to it one. We Gods Are Two. In this world, gods only exist if you believe in them. So in the underworld where the gods live, there is a constant competition to keep up follower count, or else a god will simply flat out stop existing. This is the only means of death for otherwise immortal beings. We follow Fink, a lowly nothing of a god who nevertheless does exist and therefore must have believers somewhere, but he can't figure out who it is that might believe in him or why. At the start of the book, we find him getting a job working for another god called Orpham, who is the head of a monotheistic religion which is slowly taking over the world, creating something of an existential crisis among the other gods. After all, if Fink helps Orpham, then he is potentially dooming himself with the very followers that he needs to survive. But, you know, Orpham does pay really well, and even gods have got to eat. Abandoned after 3 chapters, but you know, I do actually think that there's scope here to do something quite interesting with this. Maybe some sort of a side-eyed take on social media and the need for likes and subscribers. And by the way, please do like, subscribe and comment, and hit the bell icon to stay up to date with Pele, another dystopian novel. This one's set in a future in which humanity is basically comprising of humans who are true-born and born in the traditional way, and the vast hordes of genetically created people who do most of the actual heavy lifting in society. There's a strange undercurrent of resentment of both of these groups of people towards the other, the true-born humans having lots of stuff, but essentially a deep-seated feeling of ennui in the sense that they have no idea why they exist. They exist because their parents had sex one day unprotected, and now here they are. versus these people that have been genetically created to be the perfect miners or the perfect builders or the perfect whatever it might be, who they know the reason why they exist because they were created to fill a specific function. They don't have anything, they live horrible lives, and yet at the same time in this world, there's a sense of two-way resentment going on. Abandoned after 4 chapters. Again, potential here for something interesting, but not the way that I wrote it. The Metapath sequence. Crime novel in which we follow the unlikely duo of a washed-up hard-boiled detective and his partner, an artificial human who is genetically perfect. No prizes for guessing the partner's gender on this one. Someone has been stealing dead bodies from a graveyard. Why? Who knows? I never got that far. Abandoned after 5 chapters. Lore. My attempt at doing a Terry Pratchett Discworld, but without any of the humour. We follow Shelley and Lyndon, 2 ordinary people from our world as they get caught up in magical shenanigans. Abandoned after 3 chapters. Oh, hang on a second, this sounds really familiar. Magical intelligence. In a world in which everyone carries around portal stones, which are like magical laptops, and magic is like the internet, a hacker named Kayat accidentally discovers an artificially sentient magical creature designed to be the perfect super soldier. Being a horny teenager, he downloads it from the internet and puts it into a golem, which he has sculpted to look like a sexy woman. They then go on the run together, and he teaches this super soldier to understand humanity and ultimately, I guess, fall in love. Probably. Abandoned after 3 chapters. And finally, there was The Silent Sign, a novel which I brute forced my way through to completion because of just how sick I was of abandoning novels partway through. So it is actually a completed novel. It's just not a very good one. So The Silent Sign itself is set in a post-apocalyptic world in which these people with godlike powers have appeared all over, and the most powerful of these people are so powerful that they actually believe themselves to be gods. Lots of religious themes in my work, I'm noticing. And after subjugating the world under their control, these gods have then set themselves up in charge of a religion with themselves at the head of that religion. And we basically follow 2 characters in their attempts to bring down this false religion. On the one hand, we have Mark Handel, who is a member of a resistance movement, which is essentially a terrorist cell. And we have Gray, a snarky former cop, who happens to actually have these godlike powers himself, but he has refused to kind of acknowledge them. These 2 people then team up. They kind of clash for a while. At its core, the story is basically a bromance between these 2 men, both of whom are kind of rebelling against the same ruling elite and yet have completely different ideas about how to do it. Handel does things by the book with a team, and Gray operates alone. And breathe. Now, calling all of these novels non-stories is maybe a little bit harsh on myself. I do actually think there's potential in some of them. But the issue at their core is that all of them, they weren't really stories in the sense that they weren't really stories to me. There wasn't that inner conflict that you're writing about that I talked about earlier. And, you know, the old adage always goes that you should write what you know, right? And in the absence of writing what you know about, without that conflict from your heart that you're trying to express. Without that, you're either giving a shopping list of events and then, or if you are telling a story, then it's one that you're just basically copying and aping from somewhere else, somewhere where it's been done much better and in more original ways before. So take The Silent Sign, for example. It's basically just Star Wars. It's the Rebels versus the Empire again, just in a different set of clothes. Been there, done that, we know the story. I distinctly remember the first time that I really became aware of this in myself. It was during my 2nd year of university. I was sat in my lecturer's office. At the time, I was doing a year-long writing project, and we were given a whole year to write anything that we wanted. And so, me being the person that I am, I decided I wanted to write a novel, a whole novel. And so that's what I did. And I remember we're about the midpoint through the year. I'm sat in the lecturer's office, and she calls me in and she wants to see what I've been doing. And I'm like, well, look, I've written over half a novel. I'm about 2/3 of the way through. Isn't it great? Look at this. It was another book I was writing at the time called Devil Lived. I'll talk more about that one another time. But my lecturer, she was like, "Oh, great. This sounds wonderful. What's your novel about?" And I remember being utterly unable to answer that question. I talked to her about the characters. Oh, it's about this guy who, he likes to sell things online. He's an eBay seller. I talked about the world in which it was set. Oh, and it's set across 2 timelines. And at first we believe that they are, it's happening concurrently, but it actually turns out it's happening in the past and the present at the same time. Oh, okay, that sounds interesting. But what's the actual story? What actually happens in this book? And it's such a clear memory for me, because it was the first time in my life that I was suddenly painfully aware of this limitation in my writing that had been kind of staring me in the face the whole way through. Like, all of these things kind of hit me at the same time. And I was suddenly like, you know what? I don't think I've ever written an actual story since that very first one, which I fluked into. Like, all of these, they're just shopping lists of activities. And the problem was that for such a long time, I'd been able to kind of paper over the cracks in this failing, because other aspects of my writing were still forming and they were showing clear signs of progress. For example, my dialogue, I was getting much better at describing scenes. I was getting better at pacing. If you were to ask me what's my strength as a writer, I would say above all other things, I have always been very good at world building. That is my absolute love. I love building worlds. I love making them internally consistent. I love making them logical. I'm just not very good at then telling stories in the sandbox that I've created. But, no one sets out to be a Michelin star chef. To start off with, you've got to learn how to make a sandwich, boil an egg. It's boring, but it's got to be done. And it was because I learned this lesson that I was then finally able to address this problem in myself and start really thinking at the outset, not about characters and world building, but about the core of the story. What story am I actually trying to tell here? Because ultimately, a good story can be put into any world with any set of characters, and a good story will always come through in the same way. You plant the seed, you sprinkle it with a little bit of conflict, and then you just sit back and you write what happens. You don't need to force it. Looking back, my memories of this time, they were overall pretty happy ones. This was a time where I was just trying anything to see what would happen. I would read a book, I'd like the book that I was reading, and I would basically try and copy the same style or the same ideas and themes that were coming out of that book, seeing what worked, trying on different sets of clothes. And there was just a complete freedom and a happiness and a lack of internal editor that just meant my writing was much quicker and freer than before. The Silent Sign, for example, believe it or not, that entire novel took me just 2 months to write from start to finish. An entire novel, 144,000 words, written in 2 months of time. I was writing about 4,000 words every single day, and that is in addition to the fact that I had a girlfriend at the time, a serious girlfriend, and I was taking my A-levels as well, and doing really well in them. So there was just a freedom there that I found this untapped well of potential in myself, and I just had to get it down. And now I look back on it, it's awful, it's derivative garbage, but at least I found something that I enjoyed and I was getting it out. And just because these bridging novels failed to materialize as a finished article, it doesn't mean that they weren't worth writing. And it doesn't mean that I didn't learn from those experiences. Writing, like anything, it's a craft born out of perseverance. Each successful sentence standing on top of a cutting room floor of ideas. And now that, like I say, now that I was finally aware of these limitations in my writing, I could actually face into them and write stories that were about something. And it was with my next novel, which you might also think of as my first proper novel, The Sands of Time, that I finally feel that I started to get it right. But yeah, I'll talk about that another time. And for now, if you are interested in reading any of the fragments that I've brought up here, hey, you know, I'm backing up my life here. I'm documenting everything. I'm laying it all bare. You will find these in the description. Fragments though they might be, they are there should you wish to see them. And they are backed up forever now. And as always, thanks for watching. And next time, we'll cover something else that I'm backing up.